Hi there, let's go over some practice GED science test questions. In this video, I'm going to cover the concept of food webs, and later in the video, I will cover the concept of cladograms. Let's look at question 1 in the food web showing which organism is the primary consumer. Now, I have some notes down here. You can read through these, and once you read through these, you will probably be able to figure out that the answer is C. However, let me show you how we arrive at that. You need to understand how these food webs work. So, you should see that the arrows are pointing from one thing to another, and they show how energy flows. So, for example, if we start with grass here, grass is flowing into the insect. That implies that the insect is eating the grass. Grass is also flowing into the grasshopper. That implies the grasshopper eats the grass. Now, this confuses people sometimes, so read this. The arrow points to the organism that is doing the eating. So, for example, the insect is pointing to the frog, so the frog is doing the eating. One thing I do sometimes if I forget is where the arrow ends, right here, where you have the arrowhead right here, I put a mouth there. And I pretend this is the mouth of the frog. So the insect is going into the mouth of the frog, implying that the frog eats the insect. So that's how you read these. Again, the arrows show how the energy is flowing. Now, for this problem, I want to identify what the producer is, even though we need to know what the primary consumer is. The producer can make its own food using sunlight and using photosynthesis. Another thing about the producer is it doesn't eat anything. So you should see that grass is the producer, because the grass is flowing into the insect and it's flowing into the grasshopper, right? It's being eaten by these two. But the grass is not eating anything. Nothing is pointing to the grass. So that is what the producer is. It produces its own food using photosynthesis, and grass can do that. And it's not eating anything. And you should be able to see that as well in this diagram. So grass is the producer. Now it says here the primary consumer eats the producer. Well, I've already told you that the two things that are eating the grass are the grasshopper and the insect. So these two are the primary consumers. The grasshopper and the insect is the primary. Asking which one of these organisms is the primary, well, the only one that shows up is the grasshopper. The insect's not on here. So that's why my answer choice is C. Let's move on here. Question 2. What is the most likely consequence if all insects were removed from this food web? We have insects, they're right here. These are going to be removed. And let's see what would happen. Let's look at answer choice A. The frog population would increase. Increase means to go up. So would the frog population go up? Well, let's look. Here's the frog right here. The insect is flowing into the frog, right? So the frog is eating the insect. Now, if there's less insects to eat, what would happen to the frog population? Well, it would go down. It would decrease, not increase. So A's gone. Let's look at the snake population. The snake population would decline. That means it goes down. Let's see. How does that work? Okay, well, here's the insects. The insect is pointing to the snake, and again, the arrow points to the organism that's doing the eating, so the snake's doing the eating. So the snake is eating the insect. Well, there's less insects. The insects are gone. So that means the snake has less food to eat, so the snake population would decline or go down. That's what B says. The snake population would decline. That is my answer. Let's move on. Based on the food web, which organism is best classified as a tertiary consumer. You can go back to the notes on the first slide, and this is the same food web we've been using. So we've already identified the producer. Again, no arrows are pointing to the producer, and it can produce its own energy through photosynthesis. So this is the producer. Then the primary consumer eats the producer. We've already established that. That's the insect and the grasshopper. So those are both primary. I'll just write it once. And then the secondary consumer eats the primary consumer. I'll write it again. So let's see, what are the secondary consumers? Well, the insect is pointing to the frog. So the frog's eating the insect, and the insect points to the snake. So the snake's eating the insect. So the snake and the frog are secondary consumers. You can also see that the grasshopper is pointing to the snake as well. And the tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer. So the snake points to the owl, so the snake's giving energy to the owl. So the owl is eating the snake and the frog. So this would be the tertiary consumer. Again, the tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer. So the answer is D. We have the same food web here. We just added a new organism or predator, the hawk. So let's read this. Suppose a new predator, the hawk, is introduced in the ecosystem and it begins to hunt owls. What is the most likely effect on the food web? Well, let's see if answer choice A makes sense. It says the snake population will increase or go up because the hawks also eat snake. Without even looking at this food web, this doesn't make any sense. Because if hawks were to eat snakes, which it says in this answer choice, what would happen to the snake population? It wouldn't increase, it would decrease. So I can get rid of A, but let me explain a little further because I think answer choice A is a little confusing. In reality, right, hawks do eat snakes. But we're just looking at this modified food web or this simplified food web, and it's only showing that the hawk is eating the owl. The hawk is not directly eating the snake in this food web, so that's another reason that A does not make sense, because it says here the snake population will increase because hawks also eat snakes, but according to this food web, the hawk is not eating the snake, and if the hawk were eating the snake population would decrease, not increase. I found A a little confusing, so I wanted to explain that. Let's look at B. The grasshopper population will decrease or go down due to more owls. Well, B's we can eliminate because there's not going to be more owls, right? We introduced the hawk into this ecosystem, and again, the arrow points to the organism that's doing the eating. The owl's pointing to the hawk, so the hawk is doing the eating of the owl. So if the hawk eats the owl population decreases or goes down, and here it says there's going to be more owls, so B's gone. Let's look at C. The owl population will decrease or go down, possibly causing the snake population to go up or increase. Well, we already have concluded that the owl population will decrease or go down, right? Because we introduced the hawk's eating the owl, so there will be less owls, so this goes down. And how do you think that more than likely will affect the snake population? Well, there's less owls, and the snake is pointing to the owl, so the owl is eating the snake, but there's less owls eating the snake, so the snake population more than likely will go up, right? Go up or increase. That's exactly what answer choice C says. owl population will decrease, go down, possibly causing the snake population to go up or increase. So C is my answer. Let's look at this food web. It's different than the previous one. What does the direction of the arrows in the food web represent? I've gone over this. The arrows show the flow of energy. So, for example, the aphid is flowing to the frog is flowing into the snake, and so on. So you just need to remember that the arrows in the food web represent the direction of the flow of energy. They do not represent the movement of organisms. They have nothing to do with the number of organisms in the ecosystem, and they have nothing to do with the strength of each predator. What would happen, or what would most likely happen, if the frog population suddenly decreased or went down? So here's the frogs. It decreased or went down. I'll cross it out, pretend it's not there because it went down. What would happen? Let's look at answer choice A. The snake population would increase. Well, remember, the arrow points to the organism that's doing the eating. So the snake's doing the eating, or the energy from the frog is flowing into the snake. So since the snake is eating the frog, and there's less frogs, the snake has less food. So the snake population, since it would have less food, would go down. And answer choice A says the snake population would increase, which means to go up. So A is gone. But looking through my answer choices, sometimes you want to do that ahead of time. That's a good test-taking strategy. I noticed that D says the snake population would decrease or go down, and we just established that. The snake population would go down or decrease, so my answer is D. And I don't even need to work through B and C. Which organism in the diagram is the producer? We went over this at the beginning. The producer makes its own energy via photosynthesis through the sun. Which one of these do you think can do that? If you're not sure, another way to identify the producer is it's the only organism that's not eating anything. Which organism has no arrows pointing to it? Hopefully you can see it. C, right? Leaves. Leaves have no arrows pointing to it. Every other organism has an arrow pointing to it. The aphid has an arrow pointing to it. The insect has an arrow pointing to it. The rabbits have an arrow pointing to it. The frogs have an arrow pointing to it, and so on. Leaves do not have any arrows pointing to it. They only have arrows pointing away from it. And leaves, if you think about it, they can produce energy via the sunlight and photosynthesis. The rest of these organisms can't do it. That's the definition of a producer. So the answer for this question is C. Suppose a pesticide kills off a large number of insects and aphids. What is the most likely chain of events that would follow? Let's go through each answer choice. And again, you can always read this here, right? The arrow points to the organism that is doing the eating. I repeat that a lot because people still get confused on this piece here. Let's look at A. So let's see, the insects, let me reread this real quick. Pesticides killed off a large number of insects and aphids. Insects, a lot of them went away, a lot of aphids went away. It says here the frog population will decrease or go down. So let's look at that piece of the sentence first, right here. And see if that makes sense. So here's the frog right here. Would the frog population go down? Yes, right? The aphid's giving energy to the frog. The frog's eating the aphid. There's less aphids to eat. There's less food for the frog. So the frog population would decrease or go down. Remember, decrease means to go down. So this part checks right here. Let's check the next sentence. This would also lead to a decline in the snake and fox population. So would the snake and fox population also go down? Let's see. Frog population went down. What happens to the snake? Well, let's see. The snake eats the frog. There's less frogs to eat, so the snake population would go down as well. And let's see. The snake gives energy to the fox, i.e. the fox eats the snake, so there's less snakes. Therefore, the fox has less food to eat as well, so the fox population would go down. So yes, the snake and fox population would go down as well. A is my answer. You can move on and go through each one of these, B, C, and D. I'm not going to see why they are not true. In the following questions, I'm going to go over how to read cladograms. A cladogram illustrates how organisms are related through evolution. Based on this cladogram, which of the following statements is most accurate? Now, you can actually eliminate some answer choices right away. If you understand that cladograms show how organisms such as salmon, frogs, lizard, birds, and human evolved from a common ancestor. They do not evolve from each other. For example, a frog does not evolve from a salmon. A lizard does not evolve from a frog. If you see anything like that in your answer choices, you can get rid of it right away. So, based on that, there's a couple answer choices I can eliminate right away. Do you see which ones they are? It's going to be B, because here it says all of the organisms evolved from salmon. Again, organisms don't evolve from one another. They evolve from a common ancestor. So B's gone. Can you see another one? D, lizards evolved directly from humans. That's gone as well. So if you see something like a bird evolved from a lizard, or something like all organisms evolved from frogs, that's wrong. They evolved from common ancestors. So again, I can eliminate B and D, and now I have a 50-50 chance of guessing. But based on that, let's dig into this a little bit deeper so you understand how cladograms work. So at this point, I just recommend you pause the video and read this stuff in green, and then I will go over it. Welcome back if you pause the video. The first thing I want to go over is when you're reading a cladogram from left to right, this is called the main line. And as you move along this main line, you get closer to the present time. So this back here is way back in time, and this is more toward present time. Now the first black dot, leftmost, right here, represents a common ancestor shared by all the organisms in the diagram. So this black dot or common ancestor is way back in time, but it's shared by the salmon, the frog, the lizard, the bird, and the human. Now as I move along here, and I'll get to this little dash in a second. I'm going to move along and just look at the black dots for now. So as I move along here, here's another black dot. This is a more recent common ancestor that's shared just by the frog, the lizard, the bird, and the human. And here's a more recent common ancestor. This recent common ancestor is shared by the lizard, the bird, and the human. And based on this cladogram, the most recent common ancestor is represented by this black dot, which is shared only by the bird and the human. Now the next part of this cladogram has to do with these dashed little dashes here. Those have to do with the traits. And that relates more to the actual question involved here. So if you read right here, it says a new trait evolved just after each node or common ancestor, and all organisms branching after it share that trait. So here's a common ancestor way back in time, and then a new trait evolved right after that common ancestor. Every animal that branches off after this trait has that. So the trait here that evolved were lungs. So the frog has lungs, the lizard has lungs, the bird has lungs, and the human has lungs. Again, the trait evolved just after the node, and all organisms branching after it share that trait. So the salmon is the only organism on here that doesn't have lungs. Let's continue to move on. So we have this common ancestor way back in time. Lungs were developed. And then we move along the main line, and there's another common ancestor here. And what trait developed after this common ancestor? Well, it is the amniotic egg. So everything after this that branches after this has an amniotic egg. So the lizard has an amniotic egg. I'm right here. The bird has an amniotic egg, and so does the human, because they all come after this trait, right? The lizard comes after this trait, the bird comes after this trait, and so does the human. So based on that, let me just ask a hypothetical question, and then you should be able to answer this. What organism is warm-blooded? Which organisms on this cladogram are warm-blooded? Well, here's the warm-blooded trait. Everything after this, every organism after this trait is warm-blooded. So the bird and the human. So the bird and the human are the only organisms that are warm-blooded. Everything before that is not warm-blooded. So I hope that helps you understand how to read a cladogram. And based on that, let's go ahead and answer this question, then we'll move on to the next one. So again, this said, based on the cladogram, which of the following statements is most accurate? Frogs and birds both have hair. So let's see. Hair is here. The only thing that has hair is the organism after this trait, and the only organism that branches after this is the human. So only the human has hair. The frog doesn't, because it's all the way back here. So A is gone, and my answer has to be B. But we'll go over it just so you understand it. It's got to be, I'm sorry, the answer has to be C. Humans and birds share the trait of being warm-blooded. Yeah, we kind of went over that, right? So we're going along this main line. Here's the trait of being warm-blooded. Every organism after this trait is warm-blooded. So everything after this trait would be a bird and a human. So the bird and the human are warm-blooded, and that's why C is my answer. And just to be clear, everything actually before this trait would not be warm-blooded, because it might ask the question a little bit different on a GED science test. So everything before this trait, or to the left of this trait, the lizard, the frog, and the salmon, would not be warm-blooded. Let's look at this next question. Which pair of organisms is most closely related based on this cladogram? Most closely related really means, for these types of questions, generally means the most recent common ancestor. So you can reword this to say which pair of organisms has the most recent common ancestor. That's really what this is asking. I'm going to write that in there, because on the GED science test, it might ask it this way: which pair of organisms has the most recent common ancestor? Or it might ask, which pair of organisms is most closely related. Generally, these mean the same things for this type of question. So based on that, hopefully you can answer that based on my explanation in the previous question and based on this stuff in green. So it says, which pair of organisms has the most recent common ancestor? Now, just to be clear, in the prior question, it was asking about traits, right? That's the dash stuff. When it's asking about what's most closely related or most recent common ancestor, you want to look at the black dots here called nodes. So that's what we're focusing in on. So let's look at the frog and the salmon. So we need to find a shared common ancestor between the frog and the salmon. And the way you do that is you trace backwards from both organisms and look for the first black dot or black node that's in common to both of them. So let's look at the frog and the salmon. I'm going to trace backwards. So here's the frog. There's a common ancestor here. And there's another common ancestor here further back in time. I'm going to mark this one because you should see if I trace backward from the salmon, it also has this common ancestor. So the frog and the salmon have a shared common ancestor right here. Let's go to the bird and the human and find the most recent common ancestor of those two. Here's the human, here's the bird. So where is the most recent common ancestor for the bird and the human? Let's trace it backwards until the black point is in common to both. So here's the human. I'm going backwards. Here's a common ancestor. And here's the bird. I'll trace it down this line, and they touch right here. So this is the most recent common ancestor between the human and the bird. Well, which one is more recent? Well, remember when you read this cladogram from left to right, this is way back in time. And as you move up the cladogram on the main line, this is closer to the present. So this is more recent. So it's looking to me like B is going to have to be our answer. That the bird and the human have the most recent common ancestor because it occurred right here, which is closer to the present. This is farther back in time. But let's look at C, just to see why it's not correct. The lizard and the bird, what's their most recent common ancestor? Well, here is the lizard. Here is the bird. Let's trace them backwards. So bird, common ancestor. This common ancestor is farther back in time, and that's shared with the lizard because if I trace it back, they match up right here. So their most recent common ancestor is here, which is further back in time than this. So that's why C doesn't work either. What about salmon and human? Where's their most recent common ancestor? Well, if you trace it back, it will also be here too, right? Human, trace it back, common ancestor, further back in time, common ancestor, further back in time, further back in time right here, and that matches up with the salmon right here. So the human and the salmon have a common ancestor here as well, but it's much further back in time than this one. So my answer is B. According to the cladogram, which of the following organisms does not have an amniotic egg? So I'm looking for organisms that do not have this trait. So let's find the amniotic egg. It's right here. So remember from prior explanations, every organism after this trait does have an amniotic egg. In other words, the lizard does, the bird does, and so does the human, right? Because they occur after this trait showed up. Boom, boom, boom. So these three have the amniotic egg, but it's asking which one does not have it. So every organism that occurred before this trait does not have it. That would be the frog and the salmon. And let's see. It's going to have to be D, right? The frog, the salmon's not even one of the answer choices, so the frog does not have an amniotic egg. This last slide here is just kind of a summary of the things we've gone over. It's not a question. I strongly suggest that you read this stuff in green again. And this was shown at the beginning as well. One final point when you're dealing with cladograms, if there is anything that comes up that says a salmon turns into a frog, or a frog turns into a lizard, or a human evolved from a bird, you can automatically eliminate that answer choice. Remember, the cladogram is showing us traits and how organisms evolved from common ancestors. So with that being said, I hope you have a really good day and good luck when you take that GED science test.